After my son's death, my daughter-in-law whispered to his mother, "She won't get a single dime." My son had been gone for less than 48 hours. As I stood by his casket, the only thing I could hear over the sound of my own breaking heart was my daughter-in-law's whisper to her mother, "Now she won't get a single dime." It wasn't just greed in her voice. It was fear. And in that moment, I knew my son's death was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a war. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. The air in the funeral home was thick with the cloying scent of lilies and unspoken grief. Outside, the cold Maine fog pressed against the stained glass windows, muffling the world and sealing us inside this bubble of sorrow. Each guest who approached me offered the same gentle murmur, the same sympathetic touch on the arm. I accepted their condolences with a quiet nod, my mind a numb haze. It didn't feel real. My David, my vibrant, complicated son, could not be in that polished mahogany box. I stared at his face, so still and pale under the mortician's careful work. He looked like a stranger wearing my son's favorite suit. My hands, hidden in the folds of my black dress, trembled uncontrollably. I clutched the small embroidered handkerchief he'd given me one Mother's Day years ago, its soft cotton a flimsy anchor in a sea of loss. Then, Veronica and her mother, Regina, approached. Veronica, my son's wife of 10 years, was the picture of a grieving widow. Her black designer dress was impeccable, her blonde hair pulled back in a tasteful chignon. A single perfect tear traced a path down her cheek, but her eyes were restless. They darted from the casket to the guests, and then, briefly, to me. They stood beside me, feigning shared sorrow. Regina placed a hand on Veronica's back, a theatrical gesture of comfort. I closed my eyes, wanting only silence, wanting them to go away. And that's when I heard it. It was a whisper, meant to be swallowed by the somber organ music, but to my ears, it was as loud as a gunshot. "Now she won't get a single dime," Veronica breathed into her mother's ear. The words sliced through my fog of grief. It wasn't a cry of pain. It wasn't a lament for her lost husband. It was a declaration of victory. My eyes snapped open. I didn't turn my head, but I watched them in the reflection on the casket's glossy surface. I saw Veronica's hand, perfectly manicured, clench into a tight fist at her side. I saw the look she exchanged with her mother, not of shared loss, but of shared conspiracy. There was greed there, yes, but underneath it, I saw a flicker of raw, desperate fear. The grief that had been a heavy blanket suddenly became a shard of ice in my chest. The world, which had been muted and gray, sharpened into painful focus. The whisper wasn't just cruel, it was urgent. It was the frantic hiss of someone who had just escaped a disaster and was scrambling to secure their position. Why? The question echoed in the sudden ringing silence of my mind. This wasn't just about my son's life insurance policy, a handsome sum of $2.5 million. I knew David had named me the primary beneficiary years ago, before he even met Veronica. This felt bigger, darker. The fear in her eyes wasn't the fear of a woman who might lose money. It was the fear of a woman who was already in deep trouble. Veronica must have felt my gaze because she turned, her face instantly rearranging itself into a mask of tearful sympathy. "Oh, Margaret," she said, her voice dripping with false sorrow. I can't believe he's gone." I forced myself to meet her eyes. I saw nothing of the woman my son had loved, only a calculating stranger. My own voice, when I found it, was steady and cold, a tone I hadn't used since I retired as a chief accountant. "I know, Veronica. None of us can." I turned my attention back to my son, my real son, Not the waxen figure before me, but the memory of him. The whisper had changed everything. It had desecrated this sacred place of mourning, but it had also given me something I didn't have moments before: a purpose. The other guests saw a heartbroken mother, a 72-year-old widow lost in her sorrow. Veronica saw an obstacle, a problem to be managed. They were both wrong. That whisper had awakened the part of me that had been dormant for years. The accountant, the problem solver, the woman who knew that behind every number and every whispered word lies a truth waiting to be uncovered. And I would uncover the truth of my son's life and his death, no matter what it cost me. The drive back from the funeral home was a blur of gray coastline and bare skeletal trees. The old Volvo wagon seemed to know the way on its own, its engine a low hum against the oppressive silence. When I pulled into the long gravel driveway, the house stood waiting like a silent, stone-faced witness. Our family home, a grand Victorian dame that had seen 3 generations of Elwoods, now felt less like a sanctuary and more like a mausoleum. Inside, the air was cold and still. The only sound was the solemn, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer, each talk a heavy footstep of time marching on without my son. For a moment, the sheer emptiness of the house threatened to swallow me whole. Every room held a ghost. David taking his first steps on the Persian rug in the living room. David doing his homework at the massive oak dining table. David, just last Christmas, standing by the hearth, laughing, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. I walked past the living room, past the dining room, my hand trailing along the cool wood of the banister. I couldn't bear to linger in those shared spaces. Instead, I found myself drawn to the one place that was exclusively his study. The door creaked open, revealing the room just as he'd left it. It was a library of his life. Shelves lined with books on history and finance, a framed photo of us on his desk, his leather armchair still holding the faint impression of his form. The scent of old paper, leather, and his subtle cologne hung in the air. This is where the wave of grief should have finally broken me. I expected to collapse into his chair and let the sorrow consume me, but it didn't. As I stood on the threshold, something else took over. It was the accountant in me, the part of my mind that spent 40 years finding discrepancies in columns of numbers. My brain, desperate for an anchor, latched onto logic and order. And David's study was the epitome of order. He was meticulous, a place for everything and everything in its place. My eyes scanned the room not with the soft focus of nostalgia, but with the sharp precision of an audit. And that's when I saw the first thing that was wrong. On the second shelf, nestled between a biography of Churchill and a treatise on economic theory, was a well-worn copy of Moby Dick. It was one of David's favorites, but it belonged on the top shelf, with his collection of classic literature. It was out of place by a full 12 inches. It was a small thing, insignificant to anyone else. But I knew my son. He wouldn't have been so careless. I walked over to the bookshelf and ran my fingers along the spines. The leather on the other books was smooth, coated in a fine, undisturbed layer of dust. The spine of Moby Dick was clean, as if it had been handled recently. I pulled it out. It felt heavier than I remembered, or maybe my hands were just weak. I flipped through the pages, expecting a note, a bookmark, anything. I found nothing. With a sigh that was half frustration, half confusion, I slid it back into its incorrect spot. My gaze continued its sweep of the room. That one small inconsistency had put me on high alert. My eyes landed on the large oil painting hanging above the fireplace, a portrait of my late husband, David, and me, painted a decade ago. We looked happy, windswept, a perfect coastal Maine family. But it was crooked, just a fraction of an inch tilted to the left. David would have sooner let the roof leak than allow a picture to hang askew in his study. I moved towards the fireplace, the ticking of the clock in the hall seeming to grow louder, more insistent. My heart was beating a little faster now. This wasn't grief. It was adrenaline. I reached up, my hand surprisingly steady, and adjusted the heavy frame. As I nudged it back into perfect alignment, my fingers brushed against the wall behind it. I felt a small, rough indentation in the plaster. Curiosity overpowering everything else, I tilted the painting away from the wall. There, hidden behind the frame, was a tiny, deliberate scratch. It wasn't a crack from the house settling or an accidental scuff. It was a clean, sharp line, about half an inch long, as if someone had marked the spot with the tip of a knife. I let the painting fall back into place. I stood there in the center of the silent room, the pieces clicking together in my mind, forming not a clear picture, but the distinct outline of a puzzle. The misplaced book, the crooked painting, the hidden mark. These weren't random details. They were messages. My son, the meticulous planner, the man of order, had deliberately created disorder. He was trying to tell me something. Veronica's whispered words at the funeral echoed in my ears. Now she won't get a single dime. She wasn't just talking about money. She was afraid of something else, something David knew about, something he had hidden. The cold in the house was no longer the chill of emptiness. It was the thrill of a hunt. My son had left me a map, and I, the woman who had taught him how to read and how to reason, was the only one who could follow it. The pain in my chest was still there, a dull, heavy ache. But now it was mixed with something new, something fierce and unyielding, resolve. I was no longer just a grieving mother. I was my son's last line of defense. The next morning, I drove the 20 minutes into our small coastal town to see Richard Hale. Richard had been my late husband's best friend since they were boys, and our family's lawyer for as long as I could remember. His office, a converted carriage house behind his own stately home, was a cozy fortress of mahogany, worn leather, and the comforting smell of old books. It was a place where problems were meant to be solved over a cup of tea, a relic from a more civilized time. Richard, with his shock of white hair and kind, wrinkled eyes, greeted me with a hug that felt both strong and gentle. He sat me down in one of the deep leather armchairs facing his sprawling, paper-strewn desk. "Margaret, I'm so sorry," he began, his voice a low rumble. "There are no words." "I know, Richard," I said, my own voice tight. I reached into my handbag and pulled out the thick envelope containing David's life insurance policy. I placed it on the one clear spot on his desk. "I need you to look at this." Veronica's behavior at the funeral. It was unsettling. Richard put on his reading glasses and carefully reviewed the documents. He hummed thoughtfully, his brow furrowed. "Well, it's all ironclad," he finally said, looking at me over the rim of his glasses. "David set this up years ago. You are the sole beneficiary of the $2.5 million policy. Veronica has no legal claim to it whatsoever. It's as clear as day." A wave of relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. Then why would she say what she said? Why did she seem so desperate? Richard leaned back in his chair, which groaned in protest. He steepled his fingers, a habit he had when he was thinking deeply. "Greed makes people do ugly things, Margaret. But you're right to be cautious. My advice? Keep your cards close to your chest. Don't engage with her. Let me handle all the official correspondence. We'll dot the I's and cross the T's, and this will all be settled quietly." His calm, professional demeanor should have reassured me completely. And yet, as I drove home, a sliver of doubt remained. Richard was a good man, a loyal friend. But he was a man who believed in rules and order. Veronica's whisper hadn't felt like a legal challenge. It felt like a threat from a world where the rules didn't apply. That night, sleep was a distant country I couldn't reach. The house was silent except for the grandfather clock, its ticking now sounding like a countdown. I went downstairs to David's study, the room where I felt closest to him, and switched on his desk lamp. The warm pool of light illuminated the copy of the insurance policy I'd brought home. I sat in his chair, the leather cool against my skin, and picked up the document. I wasn't looking at the legal jargon anymore. I was looking for a message. My eyes scanned the pages, filled with clauses and stipulations, until they landed on the policy number at the top of the first page. ME818D12. I'd seen it before, of course, but I hadn't looked at it. Now, under the intense focus of the lamp, it seemed to leap off the page. It wasn't just a random string of characters generated by a computer. My accountant's brain, trained to see patterns in chaos, kicked into gear. David had chosen this. He had to have. My breath caught in my throat. Me. It couldn't be that simple, could it? I grabbed a pen and a notepad from his desk drawer. My hand was shaking slightly as I wrote it down. Me. Margaret Elwood. My initials. A jolt, like a current of electricity, shot through me. It was him. It was David, reaching out from beyond the silence, speaking to me in the language of codes and numbers we both understood. The grief was still there, a heavy weight in my soul. But now it was joined by a flicker of light, hope. I was no longer a passive victim, a heartbroken mother waiting for the world to make sense again. I was an active participant. My son had left me a clue, a key to a door I didn't even know existed. Veronica wasn't just after the money. She and the mysterious forces she feared were after something else. And this policy number was the first step on the path to finding out what it was. I stared at the rest of the code. 818. D12. What did they mean? A date? A page number? A combination to a safe? I didn't know yet, but for the first time since I'd received that terrible phone call, the fog of despair began to lift, replaced by the cold, clear certainty of a mission. I sat there in the dead of night, alone in my son's study, with a pen in my hand and a puzzle to solve. The war had begun, and I had just received my first orders. 3 days after my visit to Richard's office, the phone rang. The caller ID showed Veronica's name, and I let it ring 4 times before picking up, schooling my voice into a neutral, placid tone. "Margaret, it's Veronica," she said, her voice syrupy sweet, a complete 180 from the venomous whisper I'd overheard. "I know things have been difficult. I was hoping you'd let me cook you dinner tonight. Just the 2 of us. And Mother. A chance to connect. For David." Using my son's name as bait. The audacity was breathtaking. Richard's advice echoed in my mind. Keep your cards close to your chest. This was a performance, and I knew I had to play my part. "That's very thoughtful of you, Veronica. What time?" Her house, a modern glass and steel box on the other side of town, was the architectural opposite of my own. It was cold, minimalist, and impeccably clean, like a page from a design magazine rather than a home. The air inside was chilled to a precise temperature, and the only scent was a faint chemical lemon. Veronica greeted me at the door in a cream-colored cashmere sweater, the picture of understated elegance. Her mother, Regina, a woman with a face pulled tight from one too many cosmetic procedures, hovered behind her. "Margaret, you look wonderful," Regina chirped, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. The dining room was set for a state dinner. Crystal glasses gleamed under a modern chandelier, and a ridiculously elaborate floral arrangement served as the centerpiece. The meal itself was a parade of expensive tiny portions. Seared scallops, filet mignon, a chocolate lava cake, all served with a nervous energy that made the whole affair feel like walking on eggshells. For the first half of the meal, they stuck to safe, meaningless topics: the weather, a new art gallery in town, the dreadful state of the roads after the winter. I played along, the grieving but composed mother-in-law, while my mind was a whirring calculator, analyzing every word, every glance. They were clumsy hunters, circling their prey, and I could feel them getting ready to close in. Regina made the first move. "You know," she began, dabbing her lips with a linen napkin, "David was always so proud of his family's history. The Elwood name means so much in this town." "We have a lot to be proud of," I agreed, taking a slow sip of my water. "All those lovely things in your house," she continued, her voice a little too casual. "The antiques, the paintings. Your husband had such impeccable taste. David must have inherited that." I saw Veronica give her mother a subtle warning glance. Too soon, too obvious. Veronica smoothly took over, her tone gentle and solicitous. "What Mother means is, we were just talking about how important it is to preserve David's memory, all the things that were important to him." She paused, refilling my wine glass even though it was still half full. "He was always so sentimental about his father's things, the old desk, the books." She let the sentence hang in the air. This was it, the real reason for the dinner. They weren't after the furniture. They were fishing. I put on my most wistful expression, letting a little tremor enter my voice. Yes, he was. He loved his father's library, said it was his legacy, a legacy of knowledge, he called it. I looked directly at Veronica, my eyes misty. "That's the most valuable thing his father left him, you know. Not the money or the things, the principles." I saw a flicker of frustration in Veronica's eyes before she masked it. They weren't getting what they wanted. It was time for her to cut to the chase. She leaned forward, placing her hand on my arm. Her touch was cold. "Of course, Margaret. The principles are what matter." Her voice dropped to a confidential, almost conspiratorial tone. "It's just, I was wondering, did David ever tell you about any of the particularly valuable things his father left behind? Anything special he might have kept locked away?" The question was delivered perfectly, a blend of idle curiosity and loving concern. But I heard what was underneath. The desperation. The hunt. They weren't looking for an antique clock or a first edition book. They were looking for something specific, something they believed was hidden. I let out a small, sad laugh. "Oh, my dear, my husband wasn't a man for secrets and hidden treasures. Everything he valued was out in the open. His family, his books, his honor." I looked from Veronica to Regina, my expression one of pure, simple sincerity. "I'm afraid the only thing he locked away was his heart, and he gave me the only key." The disappointment on their faces was palpable. It was a subtle shift, a slight dimming in their eyes, a tightening around their mouths. But to me, it was as clear as a confession. This dinner wasn't about reconciliation. It was an interrogation. And I had just passed their test by telling them exactly what they didn't want to hear, that I was clueless. They thought they were playing me, but in reality, they had just shown me their entire hand. They were searching for something, and they were terrified I might find it first. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. The disastrous dinner with Veronica left a bitter taste in my mouth that had nothing to do with the overpriced food. For the next 2 nights, I barely slept. I'd lie in bed, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, replaying that stilted conversation, her probing questions, and the raw disappointment in her eyes. They were on a scavenger hunt, and I was living on the treasure map. On the 3rd night, I gave up on sleep entirely around 2 in the morning. The old house was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. I pulled on my robe and patted down the creaking central staircase, my only guide the pale moonlight filtering through the tall foyer window. My destination was the kitchen. My intention, a cup of warm milk. An old remedy for a restless mind. As I reached the bottom step, a flicker of movement outside caught my eye. Headlights swept across the driveway before being abruptly cut. A car door opened and closed with a soft metallic thud. My heart leaped into my throat. No one visited this house at 2 in the morning. I flattened myself against the wall in the shadows of the foyer, my breath held tight in my chest. A key slid into the front door lock. It turned with a soft click that sounded like a thunderclap in the silence. The door swung open, and a figure slipped inside. It was Veronica. She closed the door behind her as quietly as she could, clearly believing I was sound asleep upstairs. She didn't turn on a light, instead using the flashlight from her phone to navigate. What in God's name was she doing here? My first instinct was to step out of the shadows, to confront her, to demand an explanation, but Richard's voice of caution and my own gut feeling held me back. Let her show her hand. I remained frozen, a statue carved from shadow, as she tiptoed past the foyer and headed directly for David's study. I heard the soft click of the study door closing. A thin line of light appeared under it. She was searching, frantically from the sounds of it. I could hear the rustle of papers, the soft thud of books being taken down and replaced, the scrape of a drawer being opened. She was looking for the valuable thing she'd asked me about. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 minutes, the light from her phone reappeared in the hallway. She was moving towards the front door, empty-handed and clearly agitated. Then her phone buzzed. She stopped dead in her tracks, right in the middle of the foyer, not 10 feet from where I was hiding. She answered, her voice a frantic, terrified whisper. "Hello, Mr. Sterling?" The name hit me like a physical blow. Sterling. It sounded powerful, cold, and dangerous. I pressed myself harder against the wall, straining to hear every word. "Yes, it's me," she hissed. "No, I didn't find it. I looked everywhere he might have put it." There was a pause. Even from where I stood, I could feel her flinch. She was being berated, torn down by the voice on the other end of the line. "I know," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "I know what's at stake." Another pause, longer this time. Her whole body was trembling. "The mother? I told you I had dinner with her. I tried. She doesn't know anything. Or she's putting on the act of a lifetime. She just talked about memories and principles." She listened again, nodding frantically in the dark. Yes, I understand. Just, please, give me more time. I'll get back in. I'll tear the whole place apart if I have to. I will find that USB, I promise." She ended the call, slumping against the wall for a second, as if her strings had been cut. 2 words from that terrifying one-sided conversation burned themselves into my brain: Sterling and USB. This was no longer a family squabble over an inheritance. This was something else entirely. I was standing on the edge of a dark, unfamiliar world. A world with men named Sterling who made my daughter-in-law tremble with fear. A world where a simple USB drive was worth breaking into a dead man's house in the middle of the night. Veronica gathered herself, took a shaky breath, and slipped back out the front door into the foggy Maine night. I waited until I heard her car engine start and fade into the distance before I finally allowed myself to breathe. My legs felt weak, and I had to grip the banister to keep from collapsing. The warm milk was forgotten. The house was no longer just empty. It was compromised. It was a target. And I, a 72-year-old widow, was standing right in the center of it. The 2 days following Veronica's nocturnal visit were a waking nightmare. I jumped at every creak of the old house, my nerves stretched as taut as a piano wire. The name Sterling and the image of a USB drive played on a loop in my mind. I was a prisoner in my own home, haunted by questions I couldn't answer and a threat I couldn't see. On the 3rd day, my granddaughter, Emily, arrived with a bag of groceries and a determined look on her face. She took one look at my pale, exhausted state and immediately took charge. "Grandma, you look like you've seen a ghost," she said, her voice full of a warmth that was a balm to my frayed soul. "You can't just sit here and stew in it. We need a distraction, a project. Let's go tackle the attic." The attic was my husband's domain, a dusty repository of a life well lived. It was crammed with steamer trunks, forgotten furniture draped in white sheets like slumbering giants, and boxes upon boxes of memories. The air was thick with the scent of cedar and time itself. Emily's idea of a distraction was, in truth, the last thing I wanted to do. But I was too tired to argue. She was a whirlwind of youthful energy, pulling down boxes and laughing at old report cards and my questionable fashion choices from the 1970s. I mostly sat on an old wooden crate, just going through the motions, a spectator in the museum of my own past. "Oh, what's this?" Emily said, pulling a heavy, leather-bound photo album from the bottom of a trunk. It was my husband's, filled with photos from before I even knew him. His college years, his early career. She sat down on the dusty floorboards beside me, and we began to turn the thick, yellowed pages. There were black and white photos of young men in tweed jackets, my husband looking impossibly handsome and serious. There was Richard Hale, looking almost identical but with dark hair. They were inseparable, 2 sides of the same coin. Emily turned a page. "Wow, they really loved the great outdoors, didn't they?" The photograph took up the entire page. It was a hunting trip. My husband and Richard, both in their early 30s, were kneeling in a forest clearing, flushed with victory behind a magnificent stag. Standing between them, one hand resting proprietorially on the stag's antlers, was a third man. He was handsome, impeccably dressed in expensive hunting gear, with dark, slicked-back hair. But it was his eyes that held my attention. While my husband and Richard were smiling, his expression was one of cool, detached appraisal, a predator's smile that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Who's the third guy?" Emily asked casually. "He looks like a movie star." My blood turned to ice water in my veins. I had seen that face before, not in person, but on a screen. After Veronica's phone call, I had spent hours online, my hands shaking as I typed Sterling and Dominion Fund into the search bar. An article from a business journal had popped up, complete with a recent photo of its CEO. The hair was gray now, the face lined with age, but the eyes were exactly the same. My breath hitched. I felt the color drain from my face. "Grandma?" Emily's voice was suddenly sharp with concern. "Are you okay? You've gone white as a sheet." I couldn't speak. I could only stare at the photograph, at the 3 men bound together in that moment of triumph. My husband, his best friend, and the man who was terrorizing my daughter-in-law. My own voice, when I finally found it, was a dry, raspy whisper. "Emily, the name I asked you to look up for me. The investment fund." "Dominion Fund? What about it?" "The CEO," I managed to say, my throat tight. His name was Alistair Sterling. I raised a trembling hand and pointed to the handsome, cold-eyed man in the center of the photograph. "That's him." Emily stared, her mouth falling open slightly as she compared the face in the photo to the one she must have seen online. The pieces were no longer just clicking into place. They were slamming together with the force of a car crash. This wasn't a new problem. This wasn't David's mess. This was a ghost from the past. This nightmare had its roots in a time before my son was even a thought, in a friendship I knew nothing about. And Richard, my friend, my trusted lawyer, the man who had sat in his cozy office and advised me to be cautious, to let him handle it. He wasn't an outsider looking in. He was in the picture. He was there from the very beginning. The feeling that washed over me was a betrayal so profound it eclipsed everything else. Veronica's greed, the threat from Sterling, all of it paled in comparison to this. The man I had trusted with my son's legacy was part of the lie. I looked at the photograph, at his smiling face, and for the first time in my life, I saw him not as a friend, but as a stranger with secrets. I was utterly and completely alone. The photograph in the attic changed the board entirely. Richard wasn't just a friendly advisor. He was a piece in the puzzle, a ghost from the very beginning of this nightmare. My trust in him had evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hard suspicion. But I couldn't afford to alienate him. Not yet. He was still a powerful player, and I needed to keep him on my side of the table, even if I was watching his every move. I called him the next day, my voice a careful construction of worried determination. Richard, I can't just sit here and wait for Veronica to make the next move. We need to be proactive. We need to draw her out. What do you have in mind, Margaret? He asked, and his tone cautious. I want to set up a meeting, I said, the plan forming as I spoke. Just the three of us, a neutral place. I'll tell her I'm willing to discuss a settlement regarding David's assets. I want to get her talking about what she's really after, and I want to record every word. There was a pause on his end. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. Was he calculating the risk to me or to himself? It's risky, he finally said. But it might be our best shot to get some leverage. I'll set it up. We met at the Salty Dog, a small, perpetually busy coffee shop in the center of town. It was the kind of place where the owner knew your name, and the scent of cinnamon and roasted coffee beans clung to the air. It felt safe, public. I had a tiny digital recorder tucked into my handbag, its red light blinking discreetly. Richard and I sat at a small table in the corner, a pot of tea between us, waiting. I felt like a spider in a web, but a terrifying thought occurred to me. What if I wasn't the only spider? Veronica arrived exactly on time. She looked smaller than I remembered, her expensive coat hanging loosely on her frame. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed with what I took to be fear. Good, I thought. She's rattled. She slid into the booth opposite us, wringing her hands in her lap. I decided to lead. Thank you for coming, Veronica, I began, my voice calm and businesslike. I think it's time we came to an understanding. David left behind a complicated estate, and I want to make sure things are handled fairly. I was about to press further, to bait the hook, but I never got the chance. Veronica's expression crumpled. Her lower lip began to tremble, and her eyes welled up with tears. It was a performance so sudden, so complete, it took my breath away. Margaret, please, she whispered, her voice cracking just enough for the couple at the next table to glance over. I know you're in pain, but you have to stop this. I stared at her, completely thrown. Richard shifted uncomfortably beside me. Stop what? I asked, my voice coming out sharper than I intended. Her tears began to fall freely now. This cruelty, accusing me of things. You think I'm after money? Margaret, I just lost my husband. Her voice rose slightly, catching the attention of more patrons. You've been harassing me, saying I'm a thief. Now you drag me here to try and bully me into some kind of deal? The tables had been turned so fast I felt a sense of vertigo. This wasn't the cornered, desperate woman from the phone call. This was a polished actress, and Alistair Sterling was her director. I was speechless, my carefully laid plan in smoking ruins around me. That's not... I stammered, but she cut me off. You didn't? She asked, her eyes wide with feigned innocence. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. Then what is this? She pressed a button, and I heard my own voice, cold and menacing, fill the cozy coffee shop. I know what you're after. The recording was choppy, my words ripped from their original context. It was from a brief, tense phone call we'd had about funeral arrangements. You'll give me what I want. Another snippet, this one from a conversation about a piece of furniture David had promised her. A significant sum. It's the only way this ends peacefully. The final words, taken from a discussion about settling a bill, were delivered like a gangster's threat. The doctored audio was a masterpiece of malicious editing. It painted me as a cold, calculating monster trying to extort money from my son's grieving widow. I was paralyzed. I looked at Richard, but his face was a mask of shock. The entire coffee shop was silent, all eyes on me. I saw pity in their faces for Veronica, and a cold, hard judgment for me. My trap hadn't just failed. It had been reversed and sprung on me with brutal efficiency. I was no longer the hunter. In the court of public opinion, in this small town where reputation was everything, I had just become the villain. Veronica gave a final heartbreaking sob, grabbed her purse, and fled the shop. She left Richard and me sitting in the wreckage, under the weight of a dozen pairs of accusing eyes. My plan was dead in the water, and I had been utterly, completely outplayed. The humiliation from the coffee shop clung to me like the damp sea fog. For 2 days, I didn't leave the house. I felt the weight of the town's judgment, the whispers and stares, even behind my own locked doors. Richard had called, offering apologies and legal strategies, but his words felt hollow. He was in that photograph, a smiling ghost at a feast I never knew was happening. I was on my own. That night, a full-blown nor'easter slammed into the coast. The wind howled like a banshee, and rain lashed against the windows in horizontal sheets. The old house groaned and shuddered under the assault, and the power flickered twice before dying completely, plunging me into a darkness that was absolute. I lit a few candles, their small flames dancing nervously in the drafts, casting long, skeletal shadows that writhed on the walls. I was in the living room, wrapped in a thick wool blanket and trying to read by candlelight, when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the storm, the sharp, sickening crack of breaking glass, followed by a faint thud from the back of the house. My blood ran cold. I froze. Every muscle tensed, straining to listen over the roar of the wind. Was it just a storm? A branch falling? No, this was deliberate. Someone was inside. My first thought was the phone, but the landline was dead. My cell phone was upstairs on my nightstand, a million miles away. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at the edges of my composure. I slid off the sofa and crept into the dark foyer, my heart hammering against my ribs. I could hear footsteps now, slow and methodical, moving through the dining room. They weren't the frantic steps of a common thief. They were the confident steps of someone with a purpose. I backed away, melting into the deep shadows beneath the main staircase, and held my breath. The footsteps went straight to David's study. I heard the door open. Then, the sounds of a search began. Not a clumsy ransacking, but a controlled, efficient sweep. Drawers were pulled open and shoved shut. Books were swept from shelves. He was looking for something specific. He was looking for the USB. After a few minutes, the footsteps left the study and came back into the hall. For one terrifying moment, I thought he was coming up the stairs. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying to a God I wasn't sure I believed in anymore. But the steps went past the staircase and up the smaller, back stairs that led to the master suite, to my late husband's bedroom, which I hadn't touched since he passed. The search continued up there, more drawers, the closet door sliding open. The intruder was a professional. He was in and out of the house in less than 15 minutes. I heard the back door close softly, and then there was only the sound of the storm once more. I stayed hidden for a long, long time, my body trembling, until I was sure he was gone. With shaking hands, I lit another candle and forced myself to move. I had to see the damage. David's study was a disaster. His meticulously organized life had been violated, his books and papers thrown to the floor. It was a scene of calculated chaos. Then I went upstairs. My husband's room was the same. Clothes pulled from drawers, the contents of his desk scattered. They had searched the two places most precious to the men in my life. I returned to David's study, my candle flame casting a weak, trembling light over the wreckage. As my eyes swept across the room, I saw it. In the very center of David's large leather-top desk, a space that had been deliberately cleared, sat a single object. It was a chess piece, a king carved from black, polished onyx. I stared at it, the meaning hitting me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just a warning. This was a message, delivered with the utmost arrogance. It was from Sterling. He was telling me he was the king on this board. He was telling me my son, a mere pawn or knight, had been taken. He was telling me not to make the same foolish mistake. The public humiliation at the coffee shop had been one move. This violation, this invasion of my home, was another. He was showing me he could get to me whenever he wanted. The fear that had held me in its icy grip for the past hour didn't vanish, but it was consumed by something else, something hot and powerful. Rage. A cold, clarifying fury. He thought a broken window and a child's game piece would send me scurrying into the corner like a frightened mouse. He thought he could intimidate a 72-year-old widow into submission. He had just made the biggest mistake of his life. A line had been crossed. This was no longer about defending my son's memory or protecting his inheritance. This was about justice. I picked up the cold, heavy chess piece. It felt solid in my hand, a declaration of war. Fine, Mr. Sterling, I thought. The storm outside no match for the one inside me. You want to play a game? Let's play. The break-in left me with nothing but the cold onyx king and a house that no longer felt like a home. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. I was backed into a corner, with my reputation in tatters and my safety compromised. Sterling had played his hand, and it was a strong one. He thought he had me checkmated, but a cornered animal is the most dangerous, and I was done being afraid. My mind, frantic for a weapon, for any piece of leverage, kept circling back to the beginning. The misplaced book, the crooked painting, and the code. It was the one thing they didn't know I had. The one message from my son that had slipped through the cracks. I was in the library, the heart of the house, surrounded by the leather-bound books my husband and son had loved. The air smelled of wood smoke and history. I paced the Persian rug, the Black King cold in my hand, my mind racing. MEE 818D12. Margaret Elwood. But what about the rest? It was a key, but I was trying to force it into the wrong lock. And then, it hit me. It wasn't a separate clue. It was all connected. The code wasn't just a code, it was an instruction manual. My eyes shot to the bookshelf, to the second shelf, where the worn copy of Moby Dick still sat, stubbornly out of place. My heart began to pound, a heavy, frantic drum against my ribs. I walked to the shelf and pulled the book down. It felt different now, charged with significance. My hands trembled as I opened it, the old pages whispering as they turned. I didn't need to search. I knew exactly where I was going. Page 818. I found the page. The print was small, the lines dense with Melville's prose. My eyes scanned the text, my finger tracing the words. D12, the 12th word. I counted slowly, my lips moving silently. 1, 2, 3, all the way to 12. The word was globe. For a moment, I just stared at it, the single word seeming to lift off the page. The globe. Of course. The antique globe that had stood in the corner of my husband's side of the library for 50 years. It was as much a part of the room as the fireplace. A beautiful, ornate thing from the 1930s, with countries that no longer existed and borders that had long since been redrawn. I set the book down and walked to it, my legs feeling unsteady. It was a relic, a piece of decor. But now I saw it for what it was, a hiding place. I ran my hands over its curved surface, feeling the raised lines of the continents. I spun it on its brass axis, the way David used to when he was a little boy, dreaming of faraway places. I searched for a button, a latch, a seam that didn't belong. My fingers found it near the South Pole, a tiny, almost imperceptible ridge in the plaster and paper. I pressed. A section of the Antarctic continent clicked inward, revealing a small, hollow compartment. And nestled inside, on a bed of faded velvet, was a small black flash drive. A USB. I plucked it out. It was no bigger than my thumb, but it felt as heavy as a gravestone. This was it, the heart of the entire mystery. The thing Veronica was tearing the house apart for. The thing Sterling was willing to threaten and intimidate me for. I had it. A wave of pure, unadulterated triumph washed over me. I had beaten them. I hurried to David's study, the USB clutched in my fist. I sat at his desk, took a deep, steadying breath, and plugged it into his laptop. The screen flickered, and a single password-protected folder appeared. My heart sank. It was locked. What could it be? A birthday? An anniversary? Then I looked at the Black King still sitting on the desk. A message from the enemy. Maybe it could be a key. I typed in the word, King. The folder opened. It was filled with dozens of files, spreadsheets mostly, bank statements, scanned contracts. I clicked on the first one. A ledger appeared, columns of numbers stretching across the screen. These weren't legitimate business dealings. They were complex, layered transactions, money moving through shell corporations in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. It was a meticulously detailed roadmap of a massive money laundering operation. I saw names, dates, amounts that made my head spin. And at the center of the web, the primary beneficiary of all of it was the Dominion Fund. I had found the evidence, the proof that could destroy Alistair Sterling. But as I scrolled through the labyrinthine data, my eyes fell on a small detail at the bottom of the spreadsheet. Metadata, the file properties. My blood went cold. Author, Elwood, Charles. Date, created October 12, 1998. Charles Elwood, my husband. The room began to spin. It couldn't be. Not him. Not the man I had loved and honored for nearly 50 years. I frantically clicked on another file, and another. It was all the same. His name was on every single one. He wasn't a victim. He wasn't a pawn. He was the architect. He had built this entire criminal empire from the ground up. My son hadn't been a conspirator trying to hide it. He had inherited this poison pill, and had died trying to figure a way out. The bottom fell out of my world. The triumph I had felt moments before curdled into a horror so profound it stole the air from my lungs. The grief I felt for my son was a sharp, clean wound. This was a soul-deep cancer, a betrayal that rewrote my entire life, turning every cherished memory into a lie. I stared at my husband's name on the screen, the name I shared, the name of our family, now a brand of absolute corruption. And I began to weep, not for my son, but for the man I never truly knew at all. The truth didn't set me free. It caged me in a prison of my husband's making. For hours, I sat in the dark, the laptop screen casting a ghoulish blue light on my face as I navigated the labyrinth of his crimes. The storm outside continued its assault, a fitting soundtrack for the complete demolition of my life. But as the first gray light of dawn broke through the clouds, the grief and horror began to cool, hardening into a singular, ice-cold purpose. This ended tonight, on my terms. I picked up the phone. My first call was to Veronica. She answered on the first ring, her voice a mess of anxiety. "Hello? It's Margaret," I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. "Come to the house. Now, come alone. I have what you're looking for." I hung up before she could respond. My second call was to Richard. "Margaret, are you all right? I've been worried sick." "I need you to come over, Richard," I said, my tone flat and uninviting. "There's been a development. It's time to put all the cards on the table." I didn't wait for his reply either. I went into the living room, lit a small fire in the hearth, and placed the USB drive in the exact center of the heavy oak coffee table. Then, I sat in my husband's favorite wingback chair and waited. Veronica arrived first, as expected. She looked like she hadn't slept in a week. Her eyes, wide and terrified, immediately locked onto the USB drive. She looked from it to me, a dozen questions and accusations dying on her lips. "Sit down, Veronica," I said calmly. She obeyed, perching on the edge of the sofa as if ready to bolt at any moment. Before either of us could speak again, the headlights of a second car swept across the living room window, a heavy, expensive SUV. My heart didn't even flutter. I had expected this. The king doesn't send a pawn to do a queen's job without oversight. The front door opened, and Alistair Sterling walked in as if he owned the place. He was exactly as I remembered from the photograph, only older, harder. He exuded an aura of expensive tailoring and absolute power. He gave Veronica a look of withering contempt before turning his cold eyes on me. "Mrs. Elwood," he said, his voice a smooth, polished baritone. "An unexpected pleasure. It seems my employee has made a mess of things." "Your employee is the least of your problems, Mr. Sterling," I replied, my voice steady. I gestured to the chair opposite me. "Please, make yourself at home. After all, my husband's business partner should feel welcome here." That got a reaction, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He sat down, his movements fluid and controlled. At that moment, Richard arrived, letting himself in and stopping dead in the foyer at the sight of our little party. His face went pale. "Richard, so glad you could make it," I said, my voice dripping with ice. "Take a seat. This concerns you too." Richard looked from Sterling to me, his expression a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. He slowly sat next to Veronica, the two of them looking like prisoners in the dock. The four of us sat in silence for a moment, the only sounds the crackling fire and the rain against the glass. The night of judgment had begun. I looked at Sterling. "You sent a man to break into my house. You terrorized my daughter-in-law. You orchestrated a public smear campaign against me. All for this." I tapped a single finger on the USB drive. "All to protect a criminal enterprise my husband started 25 years ago." Sterling offered a thin, dismissive smile. Your husband was a brilliant man, but he became sentimental in his old age. Your son, even more so. A liability that needed to be managed. So you managed him? The question was quiet, but it hung in the air like smoke. His smile didn't falter. Accidents happen. A cold fury rose in me, but I held it in check. I turned my gaze to the man cowering on the sofa. And you, Richard. You knew. All this time you knew. Margaret, It was complicated, he stammered. Was it? I reached into the pocket of my robe and pulled out the old photograph from the attic. I tossed it onto the table next to the USB drive. It looks quite simple from here. The three of you, the founding fathers of the whole damn thing. Richard stared at the picture of his younger, smiling self, and something inside him broke. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. I didn't know what it was at first, he confessed, his voice muffled. Charles and Alistair came to me for legal advice, setting up offshore corporations. It was aggressive, but on paper, it was legal. By the time I realized what the money was, where it was coming from, I was in too deep. I was complicit. He looked up, his eyes filled with a lifetime of regret. I'm so sorry, Margaret. I've lived with this guilt every single day. The confession hung in the air, raw and pathetic. All the secrets were finally out, laid bare in the flickering firelight. Veronica was weeping silently. Sterling looked on with detached amusement, as if watching a mildly interesting play. Richard was a broken man, and I, the grieving widow, the foolish old woman, sat there with the evidence that could destroy them all, my entire world a pile of ashes at my feet. Sterling's arrogant dismissal of my son's life hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Richard was a wreck. Veronica was a ghost, and I was the calm eye of the hurricane. The fire crackled, counting down the seconds of our lives. I opened my mouth to deliver my verdict, to decide the fate of everyone in the room, when the world outside exploded in a chaos of flashing red and blue lights. Headlights flooded the living room, painting the walls in strobing, frantic colors. Heavy, booted footsteps pounded on the front porch. Before anyone could react, the front door burst open and two uniformed police officers stormed in, weapons drawn. Nobody move! Police! For a heartbeat, everyone was frozen. Then, Sterling shot to his feet, his face a mask of pure fury. What is the meaning of this? He boomed, his voice accustomed to instant obedience. He didn't get it. An officer was on him in a second, twisting his arm behind his back with a grunt of effort. Sterling, for all his power and money, was just a man, and he gasped in pain as the cold steel of handcuffs clicked around his wrists. You have no idea who you're dealing with, he snarled, his composure finally shattering. He wasn't looking at the police. He was looking at me, his eyes burning with a hatred so pure it was almost a physical force. This is her. This is a family squabble, a crazy old woman's fantasy. As they started to haul him away, he threw his head back and roared, a final desperate act of defiance. Ask her about her husband. Ask her about Charles Elwood. He started it all. This is his filth, his legacy. His words echoed in the suddenly quiet room as the police dragged him out into the stormy night. Veronica, who had been a statue of terror, finally collapsed. She slid from the sofa to the floor, a heap of expensive cashmere and broken sobs. Please, she wept, her words barely audible. Please, I'll tell you everything. He made me do it. I was trapped. Please. An officer gently helped her to her feet, while another stood by Richard, who didn't even look up. He just sat there, a broken man, staring at the ghost of his younger self in the photograph on the table. The chaos subsided as quickly as it had begun. The flashing lights still pulsed through the windows, but the shouting was over. A man in a trench coat stepped through the open doorway. It was Police Chief Brody, a man I'd known since he was a boy delivering our newspaper. His face was grim, his eyes full of a weary sympathy. Behind him, in the doorway, I saw Emily. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear and love. She had made the call. She had saved me. Brody's gaze swept over the scene. The weeping daughter-in-law, the disgraced lawyer, and me, sitting perfectly still in my late husband's chair. His eyes finally rested on the small black object on the coffee table. "Margaret," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Your granddaughter said you had evidence. Is that it?" I didn't answer. I reached out and picked up the USB drive. It was so small, so light, yet it held the weight of generations. It held my husband's sin, my son's struggle, Sterling's evil, and my family's name. In that moment, the world fell away. There were no police, no flashing lights, only the choice in my hand. I could give him the drive, and with it, the whole ugly truth. I could let the world know that the Elwood fortune was built on a foundation of crime, that the man this town had respected for 50 years was a monster. It would destroy Sterling, but it would also destroy the Elwood legacy forever. Our name would become a synonym for shame. Or I could be clever. I could be the kind of woman my husband would have expected me to be. I could tell Brody that the drive contained evidence of Sterling's recent activities, extortion, threats, maybe enough to link him to my son's accident. I could bury the older files, bury my husband's name deep in the digital muck. I could protect the family honor. I could save the memory of the man I thought I'd married. It would be a lie, but it would be a lie that preserved a certain kind of order. I looked at the USB in my palm. Justice on one side, shame on the other. I thought of my son, crushed under the weight of this poisonous inheritance. I thought of Emily, standing in the doorway, representing a future that deserved to be built on truth, not a carefully curated lie. What was the Elwood legacy, really? A grand house? A respected name? Or the chance to finally do the right thing, no matter the cost? My choice was clear. I looked up and met Chief Brody's gaze. My hand was perfectly steady as I held out the drive. "Everything you need is on here, Chief," I said, my voice clear and strong. Everything. 6 months have passed since that stormy night. The autumn sun, low and golden, now streams through the windows of the old house, filling the rooms with a gentle, forgiving light. The trial was a spectacle, the talk of the town and a minor sensation in the national business pages. The Elwood name, once a symbol of old money and quiet dignity, was dragged through the mud. Alistair Sterling, arrogant and defiant to the very end, was convicted on a mountain of evidence and will likely spend the rest of his life in a federal prison. Veronica, in exchange for her full and detailed testimony, received a suspended sentence. She sold her glass and steel house and moved out west, a ghost disappearing from our town's history. Richard Hale surrendered his law license and is serving 2 years in a minimum security facility. He sent me a letter, full of remorse. I have not written back. The scandal was a tempest, but like all storms, it passed. The whispers in town faded. The stares softened into something resembling respect. I had chosen truth over honor, and in doing so, had found a different kind of honor altogether. I didn't keep the money. The $2.5 million insurance policy, the catalyst for this whole nightmare, felt tainted. So I used it to start something new. In a small, rented office space above the town bakery, there is a new sign on the door. It reads, "The Elwood Fund for Victims of Financial Crime." It's not a grand foundation. The furniture is secondhand. The coffee is brewed in a cheap machine, and the files are kept in simple metal cabinets. But the work we do here is the most important work of my life. Emily is my director of operations, my partner, my rock. She has her father's mind for details and her own fierce, compassionate heart. We help people who have been swindled by men like Sterling, people who have lost everything and have nowhere else to turn. We guide them through the legal system, help them get back on their feet. We turn the Elwood legacy of lies into a new legacy of hope. This evening, the house is quiet. Emily has gone home, and I am alone. A fire burns brightly in the living room hearth, its flames dancing and casting a warm glow on the walls. I have a small cardboard box on my lap. It's the last one from the attic, filled with the final remnants of the man I thought I knew. I pull out an old silver-framed photograph. It's of Charles and me on our wedding day. We are so young, so full of a future that turned out to be a fiction. For a moment, a pang of the old grief, the old betrayal, aches in my chest. I look at his handsome, smiling face, and I feel pity. He spent his whole life building a kingdom on sand, and the tide finally came in. I remove the photo from its frame and toss it into the fire. The flames lick at the edges, and our smiling faces curl, blacken, and turn to ash. I add more to the pyre, old letters he wrote me, filled with beautiful words that now ring hollow. A newspaper clipping announcing his promotion at the bank. One by one, I feed the lies to the fire, not with anger, but with a sense of peace. I am not erasing him. I am releasing myself. The last item in the box is a small velvet pouch. Inside is the onyx king, the chess piece Sterling's man left on David's desk. I hold it in my palm, a symbol of a game I was never meant to win. But I did. I didn't play by their rules. I made my own. I tip my hand, and the king falls into the heart of the fire. They said I wouldn't get a single dime. In the end, they were right. I didn't keep a single dime for myself. Because some legacies are worth more than money. Some legacies are built not on what you keep, but on what you give away. The truth, and the chance to start again, from the ashes. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment 1 below. If not, feel free to comment 0 so we know and can improve future videos. To hear the next story, click the box on the left. Thank you for watching.